My name is Joe Peacock. I'm the Vice President of Engineering at ACV Auctions. So innovating from TECHTalks, I think, is a really great topic. When you get to hear about people's approaches to solving problems in a unique way, whether it's large companies or small companies, and so when you get to hear about these unique perspectives, it gives you an opportunity to start thinking about your daily problems in a new way.
Thank you, Joe. So me and Adam were working in the back to actually do my entire talk, so that way I don't have to give it. But unfortunately, we didn't get it done in time, so I'll have to do it in person. Scaling high-growth software organizations is a really fascinating topic. I think it's primarily because there's actually so few companies that actually reach what I would define as high growth. Even if you've been someone that's worked in startups and has been a successful entrepreneur, or someone that's worked in a higher stability organization, or even someone who's been part of high growth, each high growth company has very unique capabilities. When I think about defining high growth, I struggled into it a little bit and found a study done by McKinsey & Co. Who looked at 3,000 companies from 1980 to 2012. Basically just high level taking a look at the revenues that those companies generated on a yearly basis. Out of those 300 companies, or 3,000 companies, there's only about 910 that actually broke 100 million in revenues on a yearly basis. At the far right of the spectrum, you have about 17 companies in that time frame that broke 4 billion in revenues, and many of them broke even further beyond that. Those are the companies that you're all very familiar with: Facebook, Google, Amazon, Yahoo, etc. And the data is a little bit out of date, so there's even more in that category now. What's more interesting, though, is in this middle spectrum, where you start taking a look at the companies that have broken 100 million in revenue to $1 billion in revenue. And what you'll notice is that there was about 830 companies that broke 100 million in revenue, but less than, or more than, just less than 90% of them actually fell off on achieving $1 billion in revenues. And what you're looking at there is basically that 10x growth from 100 million to $1 billion in revenues. And generally speaking, when you're taking a look at companies that size, you're looking at companies with hundreds of employees to thousands of employees, or potentially thousands to many thousands of employees. The only companies that are actually able to go through that growth, let alone break into the 4 billion, are companies that were capable of reaching above triple-digit growth in a single year. So think 100+% year over year, not 10% or 25%. And when you go through that level of growth, there's so many different problems and ways to solve those problems. And so it creates this very unique environment. But let's take a step back for a second. When I take a look at companies, I think of them in three major phases. You have your startup phase, where you're still trying to find your product market fit, trying to find and build your first team, go through your first fundraising rounds. And then you have this much larger growth phase, which there's multiple components in there. You kind of start to hit growth. You might hit things called hypergrowth. And there's certainly a lot of really cool content now about blitzscaling and other types of ways to invest in your business. And then on the far end, you have where your growth starts to taper off. And these are companies that are getting ready to go public. They become a lot more predictable. You're making far more well-determined investments in these different areas. I've had a really cool opportunity in my career to actually work on all three phases. I started programming when I was very young. I started building websites for friends and family. By the time I was a freshman in college, I had my roommates from college building websites for my clients. And then shortly after, got into a lot of hackathons. I got into business competitions and wound up deciding, hey, I want to go do my first startup. And the first startup that I did was called GradFly. It was actually the first company in ZD Labs if you're from Buffalo. And I joined as a CTO and got to do all the things you would imagine from a startup. It was building a small engineering team up to about 7 people, doing a fundraising round, flying around the country to do sales, and also running into many of the issues that you would in a startup, whether it was finding product market fit, pivoting on a daily basis, and dealing with many of the other stresses. Ultimately, the company didn't work out, and I decided to move on, and I went to the exact opposite side of the spectrum. There's got to be a trick to this. Yeah. And I moved out to California to work at Facebook. And it was truly the complete opposite environment. Out there, I had 8 teams globally distributed. I had teams that were in California, of course, and Seattle, and Singapore, and Dublin, Sweden, just to name the teams that I worked with most often. The talent from an engineering standpoint was really incredible. The ways in which we solved problems was really fascinating, only because when we were running into larger issues, we had the people who actually had the patents or invented the solutions on deck to come help us solve problems. What I tried to do when I first went out there was actually apply many of the lessons I had learned from a startup and realized that there was actually a lot of gaps. As I got deeper, I also realized that there was actually many problems in a large company that you can solve with many of the experiences I had from a startup. And that's where I really ultimately wound up coming back to Buffalo to join ACV, which included going back to a much smaller startup. It's something that I've always really liked, the environment, just because you have a lot of opportunity for impact. But I've also been able to watch ACV grow from about 20 people to over 800 in just a couple of years. Having been directly involved with growing the engineering team, I wanted to talk about a couple of major areas in which I've seen decisions get made while pulling from our knowledge base on the startup side, but also thinking about as you continue to grow and you start hitting these much larger organizations and these much larger software problems, how you can start making decisions from the more stable, higher tier companies. The reason it's fascinating is because in growth, you're consistently going through this evolution, and therefore how you solve problems 6 months ago is probably very different than how you do it today. So the three areas that I'm going to dig into are going to be our people strategy, which is very important no matter what phase of company that you're in. Your organizational strategy, which is really kind of the function that you input people into and determine the efficiency of that output. And then your technical strategy, which is really, to me as a technologist, extremely important to basically drive the best business outcomes. Starting with people strategy, though, people strategy is so important as a startup, primarily because that team is the team that defines your business. They're the people who define your culture. They're the people who define your technology. As a software engineer, you're also someone that has lots of breadth in the company. You're probably responsible for building the front ends, the back ends, the mobile apps, as well as the infrastructure. On the flip side, on the more stable companies, you have people that are these key performers and people that you really need to fill these roles to be able to drive your organization. And in high growth, you kind of run into an interesting scenario because the growth is so rapid that you have people changing very fast. So Eli Gil is the author of the HighGrowth Handbook, which is a collection of stories from companies that have kind of met this high growth company profile. And he said he was at Google from the time it went from about 1,000 employees to 5,000 employees, and then later moved over to Twitter, where he was VP of Corporate Development, and he was there from 90 to 1,500 employees, which is actually not dissimilar to the growth that ACV has gone through. And what he said is that literally every 6 months you have a brand new company just because of the number of people that you've added. When you consider the growth that we've had, and certainly in this case, you're adding 250 to 500 people every single half of the year. And that's a really interesting opportunity to be in because that can fall apart very quickly, but it's also an opportunity to implement practices that you see best fit. In that revolution from startup to this high growth to this much more stable company, you essentially have two kind of balancing roles. On the startup side, you're looking for these breadth engineers, and on the more stable side, you're investing in specialization and expertise. The reason being is that when you're starting young, you don't actually have enough resources to hire all of the specialization that you're looking for. And when you're a more stable company, you're looking to invest very deeply in specific pockets. So for example, you might want to build a more dedicated machine learning team for a dedicated problem. In high growth, you're coming out of this more breadth type of organization, going more towards specialization. The problem is in high growth is that you actually have many of the same constraints you have from a startup, while you're also trying to balance your investments in specialization appropriately. The fact that things change every 6 months make it a large risk to make the wrong investment in specialization, because if you do, what you might wind up with is a team that no longer has a purpose, especially if the company's changed a lot over that 6-month time. Moreover, there's also groups on the breadth side that have a hard time growing up in that organization as they move more towards specialization, especially as a software engineer who's been widely involved in many of the different areas of the business, whether it was in product or design or in the actual engineering work. Some of those folks can basically, as their roles change and more towards specialization, have a hard time continuing to evolve in that role. On the flip side of that, some of those individuals might actually be the most contextually important people to the company because they have tons of information about past decisions that were made from when there was more of a startup phase as they come into high growth, and can also be incredibly valuable. Overall, you're always balancing between this breadth versus specialization from startup into a more stable company, and you're trying to find the right medium in the middle. Now, I talked about the benefits of being able to actually adjust as you have all of these new hires coming on is really valuable, and I'd say it's probably one of my favorite parts because it drastically changes your engineering culture and your recruiting. With that, what you essentially wind up with is that as you're continuing to grow and you're basically having a new company every 6 months, any parts of your culture that you don't necessarily want to keep around is an opportunity for you to continue to evolve on. Technical gaps and specialization that you might have is another opportunity for you to invest in. And when you're in this growth phase, you're constantly balancing that against how you can continue to improve the organization as a whole. And that's a really exciting thing because in many times it's very hard and it takes tons of change management and effort to be able to make organizational wide changes. When in reality, something I actually say around the office a lot is most people don't work here yet. So anything we don't like, let's make those changes and start investing into the best way to continue to build those going forward. So people strategy, again, high level, breadth versus specialization, and in growth, you're always making this balanced decision between the two. Next, you wind up with your organizational strategy, and I pulled this from, of course, Office Space because I think it's actually a great example of what I mean when I talk about organizational strategy. And there's a scene where they talk about, well, what exactly do you do here? And in each one of these different phases, your role can change drastically like we just talked about. But then there's also these opportunities for lots of overhead, people doing roles that we don't really understand or perhaps in expertise that they don't actually have expertise in. And in this particular clip, it's actually very relevant. They say, well, I take the requirements from the customer and I bring them to the software engineers. And ultimately, it's like, well, why don't the customers go directly to the software engineers? And the way that I take that is actually is organizational overhead. They're trying to make cuts and they're trying to make opportunities. And in a startup, you don't actually have these things. And in more stable companies, you actually wind up having a lot more of it. So I did some more research and took a look at what we have, and I found a really cool quote from Ruchi, who was the first female engineer at Facebook. She's also the VP of operations at Dropbox. And she basically made a comment that, as a small company in the startup mode, you're not building organizations that you don't need. You simply don't have resources to do so. And as you kind of hit this higher growth, you actually start to band-aid in these potential solutions for your organization. One perfect example in an experience from ACV is like, as a startup, unless you're doing a security startup, but you're not thinking about software compliance and security compliance around implementing an organization for that. And then all of a sudden, one day you need it. and you have to basically come up with creative ways in which you can close that. But more specifically is that you wind up coming from a very functional type of team from a startup and start driving towards a far more overhead-driven team like a matrix organization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either. As a functional team, you're a couple of people who are really good breadth engineers. You can solve problems and deliver products very quickly. And then on the larger company side, you have a lot more specialization and you can create teams very quickly to solve very acute problems without having to pull people off of the current projects that they're working on. And then, of course, in the middle, you have basically a hybrid organization. And this, again, aligns very closely to your people strategy because in people, you have your breadth and your specialization. And then there's organizations that actually map to those very well. And so as you start to make your first investments in specialization, you need to be careful that they're done correctly. So Spotify did a really great, they published a white paper, although I don't know if I'd necessarily classify it as that, and they called it the Spotify Agile Scaling Model. And this model is actually optimized for doing geographic distribution of resources because Spotify is based in Sweden, and they were starting to build teams in the US, and they wanted to be able to have a very cohesive engineering team. What they're basically pitching is that their model is literally just a matrix organization, except that it has a couple of caveats built into it specifically to optimize for driving specialization across these larger decentralized teams. They do this through a model called a guild and chapters, which are generally speaking your line managers, and then guilds being kind of the, hey, I want to have a team that's dedicated to AngularJS, and I want to elect a team to own AngularJS or perhaps Kubernetes or perhaps other parts of your technology stack. But it's not their dedicated role. They're still part of these very functional, verticalized teams that deliver product very specifically. The reason it's an interesting model is because you wind up with people implementing, and certainly growth companies implementing models where they can optimize for the people that they have. If you have a very breadth-based team in software, you're always going to implement a very functional, verticalized team. If you have a very specialized team, you have to be more careful because you're naturally adding more overhead for roles that you might have to fill that your current team cannot. So, moreover, your organizational strategy in software, and especially in this high growth phase, needs to absolutely be tied directly to your people strategy, but also needs to be weighted against what are the people that I have in my organization, and what's the best way for me to structure it, so that way my output of those resources can actually be as effective as possible. And of course, now probably the most important part is your technical strategy. Your technical strategy is incredibly important. There's so many different tool sets out there, and infrastructure and software engineering tools and processes and methodologies around the best way to deliver code. I'm personally very much a technologist, generally meaning that I'm not really biased to any certain set of tools. I think that all tools are very valuable, but at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is obviously your business outcomes. And when you take a look in the startup phase, you're very focused on getting into making decisions about what you're building and what you're buying, and a more stable company, and how can we invest in tools that are going to be things that will last us 3 to 5 plus years, so that way you can actually take advantage of the investment that you've made into it, not only from a software or product standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint. But when you dig a little bit deeper, I think one of the first things that you really need to understand and be candid about is what type of growth that you have and where your company is when it's relating to that growth. Companies scale so differently that you can't always just rely on, hey, let's take a look at what Facebook did and copy that, because it simply won't work in many cases. At the same time, you can't just take shortcuts and cheat, but you really do need to understand what kind of growth you have. At Facebook, you have this massive graph of friends and relationships and blobs that are all interconnected, that scales very, very differently from a transactional marketplace, which scales very differently from services-based companies. And all of these tools that exist out there are used for very specific solutions in each one of those spaces. If you have a gap in how you understand your business is growing, you'll probably wind up investing in the wrong software and the wrong tech to be able to make that right decision. And it really stinks too, because people spend a lot of time presenting and marketing out all of these great tools and new tools. People jump on them so quickly, and many times they actually wind up being not what you're looking for. So I've distilled down the technical strategy piece into 2 major components. The first one is about infrastructure and architecture, and the second one is filling in the gaps with software tooling. And so I'll make a couple notes specific to that. When you think about your architecture and your infrastructure, there's no technical right way to do it. You can build it in Ruby or Python or Go or insert any language here. There's no technical right way. There's probably more optimal ways. There's certainly trade-offs to take, but there's no technical right way. And when I think back to growth and you think back to startup versus stable and then what's in the middle, what you wind up with is that you need to make sure that you're optimizing your technology again for those business outcomes. As a startup, if you make the wrong tech decision, you spend 6 months rebuilding it, you probably have a company that just implemented the feature that you didn't have and probably took some of your customers. In high growth, it's really no different. And certainly in stable companies, if you make the wrong investment, it might be a huge cash implication. For example, Facebook chose the wrong data center region, you might be in big trouble. From a business outcome point, though, you can actually determine if it was the right decision or not. And that's where you start making these calculations of ROI around the technology decisions that you are making. The reason that's so critical is because Kubernetes isn't the right or wrong solution. Service meshes aren't the right or wrong solution. It's what are those outcomes? Do you need to have end-to-end encryption across each one of your services internally so that you can be compliant? Okay, service message is probably a good opportunity for you to implement. The question is, there's 10 different service messages to choose from. And so you probably need to do a little bit of a deeper RFP on understanding how each one of those fall into place. If I'm a startup, I'm certainly not going to go invest in something as massive as a Kubernetes cluster when I can run it on a couple of servers, because I might not actually have a company in 3 months from now. And then in a more stable company, you're really looking for these longer term investments, and it's cool to hear about the topics like AI today, because those are the definition of these longer term investments, where you might spend 2 to 3 years investing in a brand new space to reap the benefits of 3 to 5+ years of that technology. And those are where you can really drive bottom line improvements, especially as a more stable company, and really drive valuation. What that winds up leaving you with, though, is that you still have all these gaps in your technology now, because perhaps you decided not to choose a tool like Kubernetes to build out your infrastructure, or perhaps you went with the wrong cloud hosting provider. And that's where it kind of comes back into your software tooling and how you can best use software tooling to fill those gaps. I think software tooling really boils down to one paradigm, and as the build versus buy paradigm, and it's a very tough one. But I think in this context, it's actually pretty simple. When you're a startup, you buy everything. You buy your GitHub licenses and your CI/CD pipelines, and your infrastructure is all in the cloud. You don't even think about starting a data center, because it's just too far away. I need to understand who my customers are, what their problems are, and how I can solve those issues. On the flip side, at Facebook, they built everything custom, right down to the motherboards that they used, to the racks that they designed, to the data centers they designed, all of their software, all of their ticketing systems, their deployment pipelines, literally everything was custom, but it was all justified by their ability to drive very specific use cases and ROI for problems that they only had. In the middle, you wind up in this consistent battle between build and buy, because it makes it a very difficult problem, only because you're coming off all of these tools which are starting to not meet your use cases anymore. And yet you still don't have all the unlimited resources to be able to implement the software tools that you really want to have that fit all of your specifics. And at ACV, we've done a couple of these, and we certainly do this all the time now, but I can give one specific example of this. When I first came back from California, we built a brand new infrastructure in Kubernetes, migrated everything. It took us over a year. We're in year 2 now of using it. And it's been phenomenal so far, which is super exciting. But what we actually did about 6 months ago is we invested in building a very custom provisioning system, which allowed us to move very quickly on on provisioning new Kubernetes clusters and using them for testing, but also for redundancy in production. We built it for 6 months, and we got to the end of 6 months, and what we realized was that we were 6 months behind. It took us 6 months to actually build the system that we needed 6 months ago. And then we wound up realizing that 6 months later, we now had a whole new set, and we didn't make the right investment at the right time. In that scenario, we should have just bought the solution that would have gotten us 75% of the way there, and spent more time, spent potentially another year of investment on making sure that we could build the right tool set for the next 2+ years in that singular case. And so to summarize that, what you ultimately wind up with in this build versus buy paradigm and tooling is that your software tooling must lead your people and your organizational changes, of course, but also in your technical changes, and it must lead it by at least its implementation time. And that's specific to growth, because in a startup, you're probably just going to buy everything anyway. In a much larger company, you do a lot more analysis to make sure that you understand what that ROI is going to look like, especially for these multi-year projects. For us, when I'm taking a look at every 6 months having a new company, we really make sure that we understand, how far in advance we can go. We're really looking at 6 months to 1 year timelines. Moreover, with your technology strategy in a high-growth software organization, is that you're always comparing your opportunity cost of how long does it take for me to build something for a feature, and what technology should I invest in, versus what are my growth outcomes that I'm trying to achieve. And additionally, what should I build and what should I buy as an opportunity cost against the business impact that I'm trying to drive. So we've talked about people, organization, and how we have this balance between breadth and specialization. Your organizational strategy, which is this balance between organizational effectiveness versus the outcomes that that team is able to derive. And then, of course, you have this balance between your ability to choose the right technology for the right business outcomes at the right times. And overall, I think that these are balances and trade-offs that you're going to make no matter which phase that you're in, but it certainly makes it an interesting problem to solve on a daily basis. At the end of the day, in high growth, there's a lot of cool ways to look at this, but they call it the hockey stick curve. I think there's only one hockey stick curve, which looks right, which is obviously the green one. I don't even know if some of these other ones are even achievable. But the point is, make sure that you think very clearly about how you think about your people strategy, your organizational strategy, and your technology strategy, no matter what phase of growth you're in, and make sure that you're making the right balances in those decisions. Thanks.